Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur, and this is the final week of the 8-week course, and in this week I am going to talk to you about various aspects of development. So, what I was planning to cover in this week were various aspects of how particular cognitive functions evolve and develop during the lifespan of an individual. What are the abilities that you are born with and how do these abilities develop into fully fledged cognitive functions. Now, because I wanted to do that, I also thought it might be a good decision to cover other aspects of development as well. So, I will also be talking a little bit about very briefly biological development, emotional development and social development, though the focus in a sense will be on cognitive development, hence the title of the week. But we might, because we understand, and that is the sense that you get, is that cognitive development is actually very closely linked to so many other aspects of biological and other kinds of development as well. So, before I kind of begin talking about cognitive development, I will try and spend today's lecture in talking about some other aspects and some basic aspects of development and some basic questions that surround the notion of development as far as you are talking about a human being. So, let us begin. Now, the field that kind of does this investigation into developmental spans is referred to as developmental psychology. Now, developmental psychology is the study of progressive changes in behavior and the abilities of a child. So, there are two things you have to understand here. When I am talking about abilities of the child, I am talking about physical abilities, emotional, social, other kinds of abilities. What are the basic perceptual abilities? How well can he see, hear? How well can he put together two pieces of information? How does he understand the social constructs, morals and theory of mind, other kind of people, and the development and the sum total of all of these developments, all of these abilities that the child acquires through its lifespan is what kind of reflects in the child's behavior. So, developmental psychology per se tries to take into account both of these aspects in a more in a kind of an unfolding way. So, it is like a story that is unfolding. In the first chapter you see that the child is just born with very limited perceptual capabilities as well. So, the child cannot see properly, the child does not really understand concepts, language is not there, but eventually all of these abilities start developing one over the another, and a lot of these developments are so much linked with each other. During the course of this development is what you can also see that there are changes in the behavior of the child that are coming up. So, both of these things are very linked together, and this is what basically forms the subject matter of what developmental psychology does. It basically involves every stage from the conception of the child to the death of the child. Now, this cycle of development, this is a slightly different issue. The cycle of development also kind of keeps affecting us throughout the life, and there are two major factors that we will talk about shortly are the factors of heredity, that is the nature issue, and environment, that is the nurture part. So, very shortly I will just ask you to hold your breath about this topic for a minute. I will just come back to this after I have talked about who does developmental psychology. Developmental psychologists basically are the ones who are interested in the questions of development, and they are the ones who study a person's biological, emotional, social, personal and cognitive development. So, that this is basically the 5 aspects of development that we might talk about, and this development spans from infancy, from the the time the child is born, to adulthood and till the senile stages as well. So, we talked about what developmental psychology is, we talked about developmental psychologists do, but then coming back to something I was referring to in the last slide is one of the very important questions, one of the most important questions actually that are asked when you talk about developmental patterns in human behavior, and when you talk about developmental patterns in how the abilities of the human being evolve, is the question about the relative contribution of nature, that is the biological makeup of the person. When I am talking about biological makeup, I can be talking at 2 levels. I can be talking at the fact that what is the biological makeup of the human being as a member of a particular species, the Homo sapiens. What is it? What is the sum total of the evolution that this person has gone through over the last millions of years? That is also a very important aspect of biological makeup. The fact that we do not have tails is basically not in somebody's personal biological history, but that is basically the biological history of the entire species. So we can talk about, when you're talking about nature, we can talk about those effects, species level effects as well. Other kinds of effects that we could talk about when you're talking about individuals in question, then you could talk about things like their genetic makeup. Okay, I'll talk about some of these aspects in the lecture later as well, but then when you're talking about the personal aspects of the nature question, you're talking about genetic makeup. What are the environments, what kind of genes the parents of the person had, what were the environment, how did they bring this person up, whether those genes manifested or not, how much of the person's behavior can be actually explained back to the kind of genetic makeup that this person would have had. And again, biology is a very prominent factor in explaining somebody's behavior. It's a prominent reason about why people behave in the ways they do. So this is the nature part of the question, and then you come to the next part. The next part is the nurture part. What is the nurture part? Now the nurture part, again, it can be looked at variously. You can talk about microcosms. You can talk about, say for example, what kind of nutrition the child is getting, what are the parents, how are the parents bringing up the child. You can talk about, say for example, how is the child interacting with the environment, what are the things he is getting encouraged for, what are the things he is getting scolded for so that he does not really do it. And then there are slightly larger questions. You go above just the immediate family to the larger family, relatives and friends and those people, and then you can actually look at the society at large. So when I'm talking to you about, and you will discover there are various things during the course of this week about this nature versus nurture debate, I would actually appreciate if you could actually try and pin the development of various abilities to nature and nurture, and I'm sure what you might get at the end of it is the fact that both of these questions, both of these aspects of development, both of these major factors that attempt to explain human development kind of work together. And I'll not really spill all the beans in the first lecture itself, but that's pretty much the sense I get when I'm kind of looking at this vast developmental data, and that's pretty much what I would also appreciate you doing. So multiple perspectives, I mean, just kind of for a minute going to the background of this question, multiple perspectives have been proposed to tackle this nature and nurture debate. It starts long back as the 17th century philosopher John Locke. He rejected the notion that babies are miniature adults. I mean, earlier people might think, or people used to think, that babies are just miniature forms of adults, just that they are smaller and just that they have less abilities in terms of talking and other things, but typically their mental functioning, their cognitive functioning exactly the same as adults. Now this is something that John Locke kind of rejected, and he said that it's very probable that the mind of a newborn infant is like a blank slate. So he does not really assume anything that the child already brings brings with himself or herself. According to John Locke, all knowledge is acquired through the senses and is provided entirely by experiences. So the child, when he comes into this world, does not really have a lot of knowledge or attitudes or preferences and those kind of things, but the child interacts with the environment using the 5 senses, and then the child basically learns by hit and trial, by experience. Suppose the child wants to you get a cup of milk to the child, and that milk is hot. The child will touch it in the first part, but then quickly realize that this is this is hot, and probably I should not touch this at the moment. Next time you bring a cup, the child has already learned that okay, the liquid inside may be hot, so I'll not touch it. I'll kind of wait till somebody introduces me to it. So these are the kind of questions that have been asked, and a very extreme version, and I've talked about this in much detail when I've talked about history of cognitive psychology in the earlier course. Now, so a slightly more slightly more extreme version of the tabula rasa concept was argued for by the behaviorist school of psychology. You could remember John Watson, B.F. Skinner, and some others, Edward Thorndike for that matter. Now, Watson and Skinner argued that human nature is completely malleable. You can kind of get people to do whatever they want if you are just manipulating the rewards and consequences, the rewards and punishments. Now, early training. So, what they believed was that early training can turn a child into any kind of adult regardless of heredity. So, they are kind of, these people are giving a lot of importance on the nurture part and not really so much on the nature part. They would assume that given the correct kind of training, and I will just kind of demonstrate this with a quote that Watson famously said. So, Watson says, give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I will guarantee anyone to take anyone at random and train him to be any kind of specialist that I might want him to be. So, you can make them doctors, lawyers, merchants, chiefs, etc., and even as even beggars or thieves, or regardless of the talents, the tendencies, abilities, vocations and race of the ancestors. So, what Watson is trying to say is that given the right kind of conditions, given that you can manipulate the condition that somebody is being brought up in, you can kind of get whatever effect out of the individual. You can mold the individuals to be whatever they are, and the idea is, the philosophy behind this is that people are just the sum and total of what their environment wants them to be. So, given any kind of environment, the person's behavior or what the person turns out to become is just as a consequence of that environment. So, that is something which Watson has said. Now, there is another theory. I was talking about the nature part, I was talking about the species history. So, Charles Darwin, he is given the famous theory of evolution, 1859, the origin of species. So, Charles Darwin emphasizes in that book and very many other places the biological basis of human development, and kind of it triggered a lot of other theorists to start looking more seriously at heredity and the biological factors that make up individuals. So, these are the two basic concepts. These are how they weigh against each other, and during the course of this chapter what you will realize is what is the relative contribution of each of these things. Now, let us go a little bit more into detail about the biological evolution part. So, heredity basically refers to the transmission of physical and psychological characteristics from parents to their children through genes. So, I will talk about what genes are. So, there are two things: physical characteristics, how tall you are going to be, what is the color of your hair, eyes, what is the shape of your ears, those kind of things, and also psychological characteristics. If you are generally a happy person, if you are generally angry kind of a person, a lot of times you will see people making these kind of comparisons. My son has a temper which kind of resembles my temper, and those kind of things. So, heredity is kind of trying to include both of these things, physical characteristics and psychological characteristics, and this is happening through genes. Let me elaborate what genes are. So, I will just take a bit around that. Now, how does heredity operate? The nucleus of every human cell contains what is called the DNA, or the full form is deoxyribonucleic acid. Now, DNA is basically a long ladder like chain of chemical molecules. The order of these molecules, or the organic basis, basically acts as a code of genetic information. I am sure you must have seen this helix like figure of the DNA everywhere else, and you will see that these sequences or these components are A, T, C, G and stuff like that, and the sequence of these particular molecules kind of encodes in itself the particular information that the gene is supposed to, or that the DNA is supposed to transmit from one one generation to the other. Now, the DNA basically is in each cell contains a record of all the instructions that are needed to make a human being, and there is obviously much more room left to spare. So, the idea is all the physical characteristics, how from the conception the combination of the genes from the mother and the parent are combined, and what kind of individual biologically will be formed is also coded into genes. What kind of individual psychologically will be formed is also coded into these genes. So human DNA has like 46 chromosomes. These are basically 23 pairs of chromosomes. A newborn basically receives 23 chromosomes from the mother, 23 chromosomes from the father, and that's why he get around 46 chromosomes. Now coming to what genes are. Genes are really small segments of DNA that affect a particular process or a personal characteristic. Suppose for example, you can talk about the color of the eye, or you can say for example talk about the psychological characteristic for that matter. We will at some point I could refer to so there is this psychological disorder which is called schizophrenia. Now schizophrenia, basically the symptoms are largely behavioral, but there are biological underpinnings for that kind of disease. We'll talk about these things in a bit more detail as we move ahead. Now sometimes there could be a single gene that is responsible for inherited features, for example eye color. So there is a single gene that governs what kind of color of eyes you are going to have. However, however there could be many other characteristics which basically are polygenic. So many genes combine to kind of give you those characteristics. I'll come to that in a bit. Now genes basically how do they manifest? So genes could be dominant genes or recessive genes. A dominant gene is one that every time it kind of features, every time it appears, the features that it controls will be present every time. So for example, and that is one, so that is a dominant gene. And then there is a recessive gene. Recessive gene basically that is one that must be paired with a second recessive gene before its effect will be expressed. For example, if a child gets one blue eye gene and one brown eye gene from both parents, and he has one blue one brown eye gene, the child will always end up getting the brown colored eyes, because the brown color of eyes is basically, the brown eye gene is basically the dominant gene. So it will express itself every time it is present in the genetic makeup of somebody. Now if one or both parents have brown eyes, the couple's children will only have brown eyes because they are apparently only brown eyed genes. Now if each parent has one brown and one blue eyes, okay, so then what is the child getting? The child is getting basically probably one blue eye, one blue eye gene, one brown eye gene, and permutation of that. There is therefore a 25% chance that the child gets both blue eye genes and ends up having eyes of blue color. Okay, so that's how this dominant and recessive aspect of genes work. Now as I was saying, most characteristics however that we inherit are polygenic, and they are controlled by many genes in combination. For example, there are almost 200 genes that play a role in determining a person's height. Okay. Now through the expression of genes, heredity kind of determines your physical characteristics like eye color, skin color, and susceptibility to particular diseases. Also genes can switch on or switch off. What does switch on or switch off mean? It basically says that this is a chronological instruction. So at particular times the gene might manifest itself, at a later age the gene might not be able to manifest itself. So these are some informations about how the gene thing works. Now there is some other concept that I would like you to know. Heredity continues to exert a powerful influence throughout the maturation of the individual, that is the physical growth. How are the organs coming up, how are the different abilities happening, which are basically tied to both the development of the body, the development of the brain, and the nervous system. So I am talking about from the time that the child is born till the time that a child kind of matures completely. The physical maturation goals are complete, the psychological maturation goals are complete, the nervous system is completely developed. Now as the human growth sequence that is encoded in the DNA, as it unfolds, genetic instructions influence the body characteristics like size and shape, height, intelligence, athletic potential, personality traits somehow, sexual orientation, and a host of other details. So given that the child inherits these 23 pairs of chromosomes from both their combined from both their parents, the chromosomes have genes, they have a DNA structure. That is what kind of will unfold with time as the child is growing up, obviously with the interaction with nutrition and environment. That is what will lead to kind of determine the different aspects or the different ways in which the physical characteristics and psychological characteristics will develop. Now one of the important factors I was just referring to in all of this, all of these genes governing how you are kind of going to become is the environment. The environment basically refers to the sum of all external conditions that affect a person. Now, external conditions are everything that is outside the individual. So, for example, the kind of food that the person is eating, the kind of instructions that the person is getting, and those kind of things. Now, individuals, so you should think of the human brain as a very active organ. It's not really a passive organ that is sitting and just receiving all the input that you're getting. So, this brain interacts with the environment in various ways. Suppose, for example, I'll just tell you that the newborn's brain has very few dendrites, and it makes very less synapses than an adult brain. So, if I tell you what the neuron is, the structure of neuron is that there is a cell body, there are dendrites which are branching structures, and there is an axon which kind of relays the signal. Now, the number of dendrites basically kind of tell you how many branches, how many connections that these neurons have made, and then you can talk about synapses that are basically connections that the two cells are making. Now, when the child is born, there are very few dendrites and very few connections that these cells have made. As the child grows, during the first 3 years of life, millions of new connections are getting formed in the brain every day. How are these connections being formed? These connections are being formed in response to whatever the child is learning, whatever he is experiencing, how is he interacting with the environment. At the same time, as the child grows up, a lot of unused connections kind of disappear. So, a lot of things that the child is not really done, is not really interacted, is not really grasped that kind of information, those redundant connections kind of get away, they are not there anymore. Now, during this interaction between heredity and environment, and this interaction kind of starts very early. So, we will talk a little bit about prenatal influences. What are prenatal influences? Prenatal influences are that things that are happening with the child even before the child is born. So, as I said, developmental psychology actually starts from the conception. Okay, the initial parts obviously are more in the purview of biology, neurobiology, but I am kind of just trying to give you a brief glimpse of them here. So, environmental factors, as I was saying, they actually start influencing the development even before birth. Okay, although the intrauterine environment, where the child is, the mother's womb, is highly protected, environmental conditions can still affect the developing child. Let us take some examples. Now, for example, when the mother is pregnant and the child's fetal heart rate, when the mother is pregnant, the child's fetal heart rate and movements can increase and do increase very often whenever there is a loud sound or vibrations around the mother. So, first, for example, that is one of the reasons why pregnant women would like to avoid going to very crowded places or places where there is high noise, because it's not that the child is not really is not perceiving those things and reacting to those things. So, even though the environment is kind of insulated in some sense, it cannot stop things like sound and other things I will refer to very shortly in reaching the child. Another very interesting thing is that if the mother is experiencing a lot of stress, a lot of tension during the pregnancy, the child this kind of affects the child's growth, both physical and psychological, very adversely. So, mothers who've been found to be tense and highly in depressed, for example, during their pregnancy, the children turn out to be much smaller and weaker at birth. So, not only their physical development is affected, and there are also studies that tell you the fact that these children's psychological development, development in terms of intelligence and other things, is also very severely affected. Another example could be, say for example, if a mother is exposed to potentially harmful substances, or say for example diseases during the pregnancy, then also the child could suffer from things like birth defects or congenital disorders. Birth defects are basically when the child is born with particular anomalies, and congenital disorders are maybe the physical things are okay, but there is a particular disorder that the child is born with. I will refer to some of those kind of things now. Now, certain viruses like that of the the human immunovirus, the AIDS virus that is, and drugs like for example nicotine, caffeine, marijuana, cocaine and heroin can still pass through the placenta and harmfully affect the fetal development. It can cause disastrous effects for the developing child. So you might kind of remember that pregnant women are advised very heavily against using a lot of caffeine, using any kinds of drugs for that matter, any kind of alcohol for that matter. Now these agents, which can actually still penetrate the mother's womb, and they can still affect the child's development, are referred to as teratogens. So teratogens are substances that can harm the healthy development of the child. Now, this period, this prenatal period, is also a time where various genetic effects might show up, various genetic effects might manifest. For example, there is this disease called Down's syndrome, and I am sure you might have heard of Down syndrome somewhere. So Down syndrome is basically a disease that results from an extra 21st chromosome and can cause physical anomalies. It can cause abnormal physical traits. Some of the abnormalities or physical anomalies that can be manifested are things like there are foldings of the skin at the corner of each eye, the tongue is much wider than normal, and there are defects with respect to how the heart is supposed to function. Also, Down syndrome has severe effects on the development of the brain, and which basically this abnormal development of the brain because of this extra chromosome can result in various degrees of mental retardation as well. So again, these are genetic effects, these are congenital disorders that the child might be born with. And Down syndrome is not the only disorder, it is not the only congenital disorders or genetic disorders that a child might be born with. There are almost around 450 different kinds of genetic disorders that are now can be tested and identified even during the the person is pregnant, even during the mother is pregnant. So these are some of the ways, and I was just trying to kind of tell you, these are some of the ways that can affect a child's physical and psychological development even before the child is really come into the world. Even before the child is born, these are some of the things biologically that might create problems for the child. I'll just talk about some more evidences, some of the more studies about these things. Now researchers have reported that females, women who pregnant women who have admitted using cocaine and other combinations of drugs like alcohol or marijuana or other kinds of opiates have a high risk of having infants which will have lower birth weight. They will have a lot of irritability, they will be very difficult children to really bring up, and also poor feeding habits, which will anyways lead to the child being weaker and the development not being normal. So that's one of the things. Children from about 4 to 7 years old who had been exposed to cocaine while they were in their mother's womb were found to be more impulsive, they were found to be less able to adapt to stressful situations, and they were also had a lot more behavioral problems in life than the children from a group of mothers who had not used drugs during their pregnancy. So for example, there are things that can decide how the development will turn out even before the person is born. So there's no there's nothing that the child can do about this. This is something that has biologically pre-specified the course of development. So this is one of the things that I would want to specify, that the biological factors that we will talk about and that we are talking about at the moment as well have a very important role to play. You can talk about the effects of nurture once the child is born in the world. Let us say with with all right nutrition, with all the vitals being healthy, all the development of organs being healthy. But then if you talk about these kind of effects, the effects of teratogens or the effects of genetic disorders, this is where you are saying that even before the child is born, even before there is nurture to interact with, the child is already, the behavior of the child, or there are things that are already pre-specified, okay, because of these kind of things. So such children, 4 to 7 years old children whose mothers had admitted to using different kinds of drugs when they were pregnant have also been found to have significantly lower IQs and lower scores in understanding and using language. So overall, so these kind of things are having overall impacts on people's development. One of the major diseases that people have identified is basically something called the fetal alcohol syndrome. Now the fetal alcohol syndrome results from a mother drinking heavily during pregnancy, especially in the first 12 weeks. Now the fetal alcohol syndrome basically results in a combination of physical changes, and their physical changes include things like shorter stature, flattened nose, and short eye openings. It also kind of brings with itself psychological deficits as degrees of mental retardation, hyperactivity, etc. So fetal alcohol syndrome is basically a direct consequences of mother drinking heavily during pregnancy, especially in the first few weeks, because that is the time when the child or when the fetus is most susceptible to drug influences and these kinds of things. Now, there are some other concepts that I would like to kind of prime you with respect to how the biological development or how the biological development kind of pans out. Now, you can talk about readiness. Readiness basically refers to the age in which children are ready to achieve different kinds of milestones, like feeding themselves, walking alone, starting to speak, starting to understand particular different concepts. So this basically, the readiness of the individual, the readiness of the child implies the minimum levels of maturation, physical and psychological, that the child must have reached before the children can set off to achieve these different milestones. You might say, for example, if you are ever around anxious parents, if you are ever around new parents who have just had a kid, they are generally slightly anticipative, slightly apprehensive about how the development of the child is panning out, and one of the ways that doctors kind of counsel them with is to try and tell them to keep track of these developmental milestones. If the child is like 3 months old, whether the child does these activities, if the child is 6 months or 9 months or 12 months old, what are the kind of activities that the child does, and this is typically how the doctors kind of keep track of healthy development of the child. I'll give you one example. For example, toilet training goes smoothly when it kind of begins around 18 to 24 months of age, and there could be obviously a plus minus a few months, month here or month there. But if, say for example, over anxious parents are trying to enforce the same any earlier or even any later for that matter, this could lead to particular kinds of anomalies, insufficient bladder control or bedwetting, because the child is not really been trained to control it in when they are trying to do toilet training much later, or insufficient, or other kind of things. I'll talk about this at some later point. Sigmund Freud, for that matter, actually placed a special emphasis on toilet training and said that it's one of the things that kind of defines how the child is going to pan out in the rest of his life. Again, that was kind of a long shot, but it is something that is very important, that parents do not force the child to overachieve or underachieve with respect to these developmental milestones. Now, another important aspect that I could talk to you about is the sensitive periods. Sensitive periods basically refer to times in the children's life cycle, in their lifespan, when they are more susceptible to particular types of environmental influences. Events that occur during a sensitive period can permanently alter the course of development. For example, the very important aspect of forming a loving bond with a caregiver early in life is supposed to be very crucial for the optimal development, psychological, emotional development of the child. Similarly, it is also very crucial for babies to be exposed to normal speech during the first year in order to be able to develop normal speech capabilities. If you remember, I've talked to you about this in much detail when we were doing the acquisition of language. There was an entire, I think, a couple of lectures that I've talked to you about these things. So this is the concept of critical period. If the child is not received human speech during the first 1 year, 1.5 years of life, they will not be able to acquire the phonological characteristics and then language eventually. Other concepts I can talk to you about is deprivation and enrichment. Now, what can happen is that the child might suffer a lack of this normal nutrition, normal stimulation, comfort or love during those sensitive periods, and that can have adverse consequences for the child's healthy development. Or there is this concept of enrichment, when an environment is deliberately made more stimulating, loving and caring, helping the child to develop in a proper way, to achieve those milestones at proper time spans and those kind of things. And both of these things are possible, both of these things can happen with when children are growing up. Say for example, and these things have consequences. So when children are deprived of conducive environments in terms of proper nutrition, care and love and affection, they might turn out to be mute, retarded and emotionally damaged. So it's very important, it's highly challenging, and it's highly important that the right kind of stimulation be provided to the child, the best kind of nutrition be provided to the child, and also the the kind of social environment, the caring, love, affection that the child needs during its formative years. Another aspect, milder forms of deprivation, not really something as versus this, milder forms of deprivation in terms of perceptual, intellectual or emotional aspects may occur in families that are trying to cope with poverty. If a child is born to very poor parents, one of the things that might happen is, say for example, there is nutritional deprivation. If the family is not really able to get food on their plate, leave alone talking about that, the kind of nutrients that should be available, the kind of vitamins and minerals that the child needs. So this is something about biological part. Also, families coping with poverty characteristically sometimes do not really have a very conducive psychological climate as well. There might be quarrels, and there might be tensions, and there might be struggles, which obviously in some sense will have an impact on the way the child is going to develop. So this is one of the aspects of, say for example, how these things, how these very small but very significant things can alter a person's entire lifespan. And causes of these kind of things may be maybe a variety. So for example, poor parents may not be able to give their children the needed resources such as nutritional meals, healthcare, or even learning material. The kind of toys and the kind of material that the child interacts with also have a very important role to play in the overall cognitive and social emotional development of the child. As a result of when the poor parents cannot really provide that, as a result, impoverished children tend to be sick more often. Their mental development sometimes lag behind their age controlled peers, and they often end up doing poorly at school. Now you could actually look at this, take a step back and think, this is nothing to do with the child. This is not really the child's mistake. It's just that the situations are like that. So in some sense, the biological factors are very important to keep account of. Also, the stresses of poverty can also be very hard on parents, leading to marriage problems, less positive parenting, and poorer parent-child dynamics, poorer parent-child relationships. Now these things also, these result in emotional turmoil that the child will experience, and that will also damage the child's socio-emotional development, as I was saying earlier. Adults who've grown up in poverty often remain trapped in a vicious cycle of continued poverty, because one of the things can happen is that they are not really understanding the world in a particular way. They are not really cognitively as developed as some of the other more privileged peers, and those kind of things kind of will have consequences. If you're not really being able to do very good at school, you're not really going to end up at a higher social standing, and because you're not going to reach that, your own children might also end up in the same in the same circle of poverty, and these kind of things kind of reinforce each other, other than so many other things. So this is also very disturbing. But let's move to the enriched environment part. Say for example, sometimes more fortunate parents, they can take initiative, and they can especially design novel, complex and stimulating environments. These are referred to as enriched environments that may lay the foundation of the child, that may lay the foundation of the child developing in optimal manner. They can actually help the child develop in a brighter fashion. They can actually lead to brighter and more intelligent and more responsive children. Parents can, say for example, encourage exploration and stimulation play by paying attention to what is holding the child's interests, what are the initial things that are affecting him, what does he like to do, what does he or she does not like to do. In that sense, encourage the child to interact with the environment and discover for himself. Also, this enriched environment, there is also a lot of value in actively enriching things like sensory experiences. Say for example, it might be a good idea to surround children with so many different colors, different kinds of music at different times, people who will interact with the child, and things that the child would kind of interact with, touch, taste, smell. So this is basically what encourages or enhances the child's interest in the environment. A lot of what the child is going to do once the child grows up is interact with the environment, and if in the formative years the child gets familiar and interested, let us say intrigued by different aspects of the environment, that might also have good consequences for the child's development. Children, and it has been seen, children progress most rapidly when they have responsive parents and when they have stimulating play materials at home. So this is also been shown in research, has been reported that children, their course of development is more rapid. They kind of tend to be more say for example, they could have higher IQs, they could have higher other kinds of skills If the parents are very responsive, they are attending to the child more often, and they are providing the child with stimulating materials. Let's talk a little bit about prenatal development. The prenatal period basically extends from conception to birth and lasts for about 266 days. It consists of the following stages. I'll just briefly run you through this developmental stages. The first stage is referred to as the germinal stage. It refers to the first 2 weeks following the conception, so the conception basically happens if one of the millions of sperm cells penetrates the ovum's outer membrane, and if it has been fertilized, this turns to form a zygote, which is basically a single cell. Now, the single cell, this zygote, starts dividing, goes through a process of repeated division, which after a week consists of around 150 cells, and these cells again start dividing to actually lead to the formation of the child. Starting from 2 to 8 weeks is the embryonic stage that basically follows conception. During this stage, the cells divide and they begin to differentiate into different kinds of body parts like bones, muscles, and different body organs. At around 21 days, the spinal cord and eyes start to appear, 24 days heart starts to appear, 28 days arms and legs start forming, and about 42 days features of the face start shaping up. Towards the end of this embryonic stage, the organism has developed a number of different body organs. Then there is the fetal stage. The fetal stage is more it's a slightly important stage. It begins from 2 months after the conception and lasts until birth. So, at the end of the fetal stage, the fetus converts into a newborn child. So, this is the final stage. During this stage, the fetal develops vital organs such as lungs, physical characteristics that are distinctly human, and this is also a stage where fetal development is highly vulnerable to effects of drugs and other harmful agents. So, the teratogens I was talking to you about, this is one of the stage. This is the stage that the effects are most felt. Now, the placenta, an organ that connects the blood supply of the mother to the fetus, acts like a filter, allowing oxygen and nutrients to pass through while keeping out toxic or harmful substances, teratogens, as I was saying. However, certain viruses, HIV, etc., can really affect the child's development, and they can, hamper the child's overall development. I've talked to you about this in a while. Now, there is this test called amniocentesis, which is a medical test done between 14 to 20 weeks of pregnancy. This basically involves inserting a long needle through the mother's abdominal muscles into the amniotic fluid in which the child is, which is surrounding the fetus, which can help identify many genetic anomalies. So, this is one of the things that kind of can help people testing for and ruling out particular genetic anomalies that might be present and taking precautionary actions. Now, most human characteristics are not determined by the action of a single gene pair, but there are some striking exceptions. As I was saying, single genes can affect something. So, one of the of special interest from the psychological viewpoint are diseases like phenylketonuria and Huntington's disease, both of which involve deterioration of the nervous system and also are linked with associative behavioral and cognitive problems. Let's talk about these diseases a little bit. Now, phenylketonuria results from the action of a recessive gene inherited from both the parents. The infants here cannot digest an essential amino acid, that is phenylalanine, which causes the buildup of this thing in the brain, and it kind of is poisonous to the nervous system and it causes irreversible brain damage. Now, children with phenylketonuria are severely retarded, and generally their lifespan is around the age of 30 years. If PKU is discovered at birth and the infant is immediately placed on a diet that controls the levels of phenylalanine, there are chances of survival with good health and also proper intelligence. So, this is one of the things that tests like amniocentesis can help us do. That if you can kind of figure out that this gene is missing, that there is a high chance of having phenylketonuria, doctors along with the parents can work together a regimen that will save the child from the harmful effects of PKU. Also, another example, a single dominant gene causes Huntington's disease. Now, the long term course of the disease basically leads to degeneration of certain areas in the brain, and then progressive degeneration of which happens continues for over 10 to 15 years. Now, individuals with Huntington's disease gradually lose the ability to talk and control their movements, and they show marked deterioration in memory and mental ability. So, this is something very important. The problem is both in terms of motor abilities and also other mental abilities. Now, this disease usually kind of strikes when a person is around 30 to 40 years of age. Till then, there is no evidence of the disease. So, if you remember, I was talking about certain genes being on and off for particular periods. Huntington's disease is one such example that does not manifest itself till the person has achieved the age of around 30 to 40 years. Now, that the Huntington's the Huntington's disease gene has also been isolated, geneticists can test individuals that are at risk for Huntington's and can determine whether they carry that Huntington's gene or not. And that's a very important, that's a very nice way of testing earlier and saving people from these kind of things. Now, I am just kind of still going to talk a little bit more about the hereditary part. One of the very important things that has been done, or say for example that people study in order to understand the effects of genetic variation, is to look at the similarities in behavior among individuals who are related. Okay, say for example that you will see hear people talking about things like certain traits run in the family. But if we know the family members, we know that the fact that family members are not genetically linked, but they also share the same environment. So, you can talk about these two siblings behave in much the same way, or for example the child behaves like the father or the mother. But the fact is you cannot not be sure whether it is biological or it is environmental, because the fact is that even though they share the genetic makeup, they also share the same house. The child might be learning all of these things just through the nurture, or the siblings might be learning from each other just because they are spending so much time with each other. Now, for example, if musical talent runs in the family, one can't be sure whether the children inherited this thing from their parents, or because their parents were practicing and encouraging music, that is why they have just grasped it by way of nurture. So, I am just trying to lead to solve this problem. So, the question could be, do genetic tendencies or environmental conditions play the more important role? To answer this question, what psychologists have done is they have turned to studies of twins, especially twins who have been adopted and raised in separate environments. Now, this is something which takes a lot of effort, very hard to do, but this is something that can actually help solve this problem. There are two kinds of twins possible: monozygotic or identical, which share the exact same genetic structure, or dizygotic or fraternal, which basically are very closely related but do not have identical genetic structure. Studies that compare the identical and fraternal twins have helped sort out some of the influences of environment and heredity. Identical twins are more similar in intelligence than fraternal twins, even when they are separated at birth and raised in different homes. Identical twins are also more similar than fraternal twins in some personality characteristics and also in susceptibility to things like schizophrenia. A recent study has shown that the amount of gray matter, even in the brain, amount of gray matter in the brain is more correlated in identical twins than in fraternal twins, and also there is a correlation with the overall intelligence. So, if you look at all of these kinds of evidences that have kind of accrued from studies of identical twins versus studies of fraternal twins, this kind of tells you that biology is playing a very important role in how individuals are actually shaping out to be. One of the surprising studies of adopted children suggests that genetic influences may become much stronger as people age. One of the things I have seen people remark a lot is that when say for example daughters or sons, as and when they are aging, they start resemble, at least facially, their fathers a lot. I mean the dominant parent a lot. So, that is one of the things that you can say, and it kind of goes around in common knowledge as well, that these genetic influences, the influence of biology, start playing up much more stronger as the individuals are aging. Similarly, psychological traits of younger children are not really particularly similar to those either of the biological or adopted parents, but as they grow older, they become more similar to their biological parents than to their adopted parents in such things as general cognitive ability. So, these are some of the things that are very important. But then what does the environment do here? What is the environmental influence on gene action? The inherited potential which an individual enters the world with, the genetic makeup, is also very much influenced by the environment it's kind of encountering. One of the examples that I have taken is the thing called is the disease called diabetes. Now, the tendency to develop diabetes is hereditary. It's hereditary in a lot of people, although the exact method of transmission is not really known, but this is something that is the pancreas are not producing enough insulin to burn the carbohydrates and provide energy for the body. So there are residual residual carbohydrates, residual sugar that's floating in the blood and causing a lot of damage. Now scientists assume that genes determine the production of insulin. So that's how this link between heredity. But then people who carry the genetic potential for diabetes do not always develop the disease. It's like, say for example, for some cases, if both parents are diabetic, it's highly likely that the child might also have diabetes, but the child loses or chooses or adopts a lifestyle that kind of does not end up having diabetes. How can this happen? So this could happen, say for example, if the environmental factors that also contribute to diabetes are controlled. For example, the genetic influence may not really always manifest if the person is following a particular lifestyle, proper diet, proper exercise, and avoiding the environmental features that lead to the person having the disease. So I've talked to you about a lot of these things. Basically I talked predominantly about biological aspects of evolution today, biological aspects of development today, but there's also a lot of stress on the environment part. When you talk about other kinds of development, emotional, social and other things, you will see that there is a kind of a trade-off there, but certainly today I hope you kind of appreciate the fact that there are a lot of biological factors that affect the course of human development. Thank you.